Hey, everybody. Welcome to today's Research America Alliance discussion. Thank you so much for joining, and as always, for your partnership in Research America. You've heard this before. If your organization isn't a member, please, stay as our guest today, but get in touch with my colleague, Joel. His email is in the chat. Call me, email me. My cell is in my address line or signature line. Let's talk about it, because we are going to need as many members as we can. Next year is going to be an interesting one, as our wonderful guest today, Emily Holubowich, she is the National Senior Vice President of Federal Advocacy at the American Heart Association, will attest, my guess is. We've asked Emily to join us to talk all things end of this Congress, beginning of next, appropriations and policies that bear on the future of medical progress, public health progress, and R&D. And as always, please type your questions into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And let me, with that, turn the conversation over to Emily.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Ellie. It's such a delight to be with you, my dear friend, and thank you all for joining us today. I've been saying this a lot recently, but I don't know about you, but I'm ready for some precedented times. After the last mostly almost 3 years now, but happy to chat about the end of this year in the dash, as well as what we're seeing ahead. And so first and foremost, of course, want to dive into where we are right now. Obviously coming off of the election with Democrats maintaining their majority in the Senate, House Republicans taking the majority by a narrow margin, essentially the margin that the Democrats have now. And so the framing, I think, generally for the remainder of this Congress and next Congress is that anytime there's a split Congress, or certainly close margins, it's really hard to be productive. I think layering on a general election cycle, which, if you haven't noticed, has started already, just adds another layer of silliness, if you will, to the process, making it that much harder to do productive things. So in the spirit of that, what we're looking at ahead for the lame duck is a really packed agenda. There is a long list of to-dos. I think there are high aspirations to do many of those in the next couple of weeks, both on the authorizing side as well as the appropriation side, which I know is the focus for today. I think inevitably things are going to fall off. So just bear that in mind. But the big one, and of course the engine driving this whole train, is the appropriations legislation, which is the big unfinished business for the 117th Congress. As many of you probably know, we are operating under a continuing resolution until December 16th, which, when they selected that date, I said, oh, that's cute. So we're pretending we're not going right up until Christmas.
Oh, Emily, hold on one sec. Are you on mute? Can folks hear us?
Oh, no. I hear you.
We got a chat that we are not. Oh, okay. It looks like we're okay. Woof. Okay.
All right. Yeah, you don't want me to start over. So we're going to go right up until December 23rd, possibly even December 24th. I think that's clear. There's just simply not enough time between now and December 16th to do everything. So we should expect at least one more continuing resolution. And I think the question is it a 1 week continuing resolution, or is it a year-long continuing resolution? So if you have not yet signed the Research America letter urging Congress to act on appropriations now, please do so. I think it's really important that lawmakers hear from the community that keeping funding at current levels and keeping the government running on autopilot is not acceptable. The good news is I think there is general consensus, and that's confirmed from reporting today, that even among the bipartisan four corners of leadership, that they don't want to do a continuing resolution for the year, that they do want to close out business. They want to do an omnibus. And there are a lot of incentives to doing that. I think number one, Leader McCarthy in the House, who is running to be Speaker of the House, is in a precarious position of potentially not having the votes he needs. Anything he can do to clear this year's business, to not add to the drama of next year's business, I think is an incentive for him to want to see this done. We have several of what we call the cardinals, so the leaders on appropriations who are retiring. Among them, the chair and vice chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Senator Shelby and Senator Leahy. So there's a legacy issue here for them, I think, to want to close out their last official appropriations bill. There's also ranking member Roy Blument from Missouri, who is also retiring, who is the ranking member of the subcommittee with jurisdiction over NIH, CDC, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and other health programs. So there's a lot of incentives in terms of people moving on and just wanting to have that one last go. And there are earmarks. So there are a lot of earmarks in this legislation. It remains, I think, to be determined, but it is likely that at least in the House, they will pass a rules package that does not have earmarks, allow earmarks on the legislation next year. So again, there's that added incentive of lawmakers who have the opportunity to drive some direct investment in their districts and states and have skin in the game and want to see this happen. I think the disincentive here, as I mentioned, is just time. And so as we know, I think the good news is they're planning to all come together, the four corners of appropriations, the four corners of leadership tomorrow, to try to hash out just what's the overall top line, what's the overall amount of spending that we have to work with. Once that is agreed upon for both defense and non-defense programs like research funding, that will allow the appropriators to go forth and then write those bills. And that takes time. And so there's the macro question of how much money are we talking about here? But then there are all the issues around the micro of how much is going to go to what agencies, what programs. And then there are questions around things we call policy riders, which are language tucked away in appropriations bills that direct the funding or prohibit funding for different things. And so how are those going to be handled? So getting the top line number is great. There's still a lot that needs to happen. And again, not a lot of time. And of course, as we get closer to that Christmas Eve, December 24th, people are going to start losing interest, particularly members who, are retiring or lost their reelection. They're going to start wanting to bail and get home to their families. And so I think the time really, I don't doubt the lack of political will, but the time of this package and the potential size of this package. So we're not just talking about appropriations legislation. We're talking about basically all the unfinished business of the 117th Congress, and everyone wants to move that before the end of the year, and their priority before the end of the year. And so for me, there's a question of, does the package begin to kind of collapse under its own weight and just its own scale and size, much in the way we saw Build Back Better kind of just implode because of just all the things that were tacked on. So I'm not going to make predictions. But those are some of, I think, the incentives and disincentives for moving forward the end of year. And then, of course, as we talk about the appropriations legislation being that train that's driving, the engine that's driving this train, there are all the other things. So some of the things top of mind probably for our listeners today, Ellie, are, of course, Cures 2.0. There's the Pasteur Act around antimicrobial resistance. There's the Prevent Act, which has some interesting authorizing provisions for CDC. There are the, I think we're calling them user fee US scores. There's the user fee riders that were really sort of additional authority, new authorities for FDA. There's a lot of things. And a number of those things are very important to Ranking Member Richard Burr from the Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee, who is leaving Congress. So again, and that's just like public health science. There's a whole bunch of other things that need to happen in addition to the emergency supplemental funding. People probably know the administration has requested $38 billion in emergency funding for Ukraine aid, $9 billion for COVID relief, some hurricane relief. I think it's likely we're not going to see the COVID money. There it was interesting to me almost immediately upon news breaking about the request submission from the administration to see folks like Ranking Member Shelby saying COVID money is not happening. Like there's no more COVID money. So I would not put any money, pun intended, on that happening. But I do think the Ukraine aid and the hurricane relief will probably see funding there. So maybe I'll pause, Ellie. That's for me, end of year wrap up. Again, not making predictions, and then happy to talk more about, what we think we're looking at next year.
No, and I think that's great. I'm just going to piece together intel from here and there, take this, with a grain of salt or whatever. But what I heard is that there's been work all through Thanksgiving, except for Thanksgiving Day, particularly on the House side, and that there is a notion, which is not going to surprise anyone, of not considering any policy riders that were not part of last year's appropriations measure, which would knock a lot of these really important things off in the interest of time. And, once you open a door, that door gets wider and wider and wider. And another concern that is driving getting this done is if this kind of ends up in the debt ceiling debate, it complicates that debate and all of the mayhem that is likely to occur with that early next year too. So there really is some incentive to get this done. The other thing I did hear is that on the House side, there's been some implicit agreement between the R's and the D's that involves a little bit more money for defense, and then moving that over to the Senate as quickly as possible. So, we'll see. I'm not typically a glass half full type of person, but I kind of think they may get this done, and I think that, I don't know if you mentioned that, but there's really the likelihood, it's almost certain that they'll do at least a week-long CR to buy themselves more time.
Yeah, for sure.
And they definitely have a couple times since, the many blocks I've been around, that they've worked through Christmas, and they always threaten it, we're working through Christmas. We're working through the holiday. We are. Yes. And it doesn't happen to that, but that puts pressure on members to get it done. So
it does. Yeah. I mean, technically they can go up until January 2nd, right? I mean, there's one on January 3rd. So there is time. Again, I think the December 23rd is not a hard deadline. Certainly, there is another week after that, but it gets harder. I mean, expecting
a lot harder.
People to come back after Christmas is just not realistic, especially for those members who are retiring and leaving. So, and you mentioned, so kind of bleeding into 2024, it's somewhat triggering for me, the debt ceiling, and, repeating the mistakes of sort of the 2010 midterms. I mean, all along, for me, the parallels between this moment and the 2010 midterms have been eerily familiar. I mean, if you think about, significant government spending on the heels of a crisis. At the time, it was, the Great Recession, and the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and then the sort of, the surgence of the Tea Party. And this is typical. You kind of see these eras throughout history of, a significant federal spending in the time of a crisis, and then sort of a retrenchment, if you will, back to austerity, and sort of address the debt ceiling and the debt. But, it has been, and there were indications of this leading up to these midterms, the 2022 midterms, of the sort of the deficit hawks rising like phoenixes from the ashes, and suddenly we
absolutely
debt again, and we're going to use the debt limit to try to drive those cuts on entitlements and domestic spending. That's exactly what happened after the 2010 midterms, where, again, appropriations was not done. They weren't able to get it done. They ended punting into the next Congress. And that's where we saw, with a new Republican majority under Speaker Boehner after the Tea Party wave, this sort of the first introduction of appropriations legislation that significantly cut non-defense discretionary programs. But then ultimately the threat around the debt limit and what we saw as the Budget Control Act, which led to 10 years of, austere budget caps and sequestration. And so again, very triggering having lived through that to see, I'm a little less worried about that given the margins in the House are so close. I'd also like to believe that people have learned their lesson from that. And there are a few people that want to relive that experience, myself included. But the debt limit is huge and there will be a lot of shenanigans around the debt limit. And so this is one to watch as a leverage point for next year. And if nothing else, just kind of sucking air and energy out of the room, even if sort of nothing materializes from it ultimately. It's just eating up time on the clock where you could be doing actual business around appropriations legislation. So that's something I'm watching very closely and hoping we've learned from the last 10 years that is not the best way to manage the federal government. But we shall see.
I think it's true. Yeah, and it's one of the reasons that, we absolutely need people willing to speak up and need advocates, because there could be a perfect storm. We're at 126% of the GDP, the debt, right? A lot of that is interest. That makes people very uncomfortable about, something needing to be done. And we did have Republicans and Democrats both talking about budget caps, at least a 2-year deal, and we don't know what those caps will look like. We have to make the case that spending on research is undervalued, if anything, and we may be trying to do that when there are investigations taking place, potentially not only Wuhan, but is NIH spending its money correctly and efficiently? There was some talk about that starting last year in the Energy and Commerce Committee with Republicans looking into this and talking to various folks about that. So
absolutely,
we just have to keep our eyes wide open and be willing to really defend what we believe in, because I think it's going to be under a microscope potentially next year.
I think you're absolutely right. Now, it's certainly with the results of the election and Democrats maintaining control of the Senate, actually possibly picking up a seat in the Senate, we'll see with the Georgia runoff December 6th. And of course, in the Biden administration, I think that the opportunity for major restructuring or overhaul is unlikely. But it is still important that as a community that cares about research and public health, that we are there and we respond and we're communicating the value to everyone. I do worry that there is, in the interest of improvement, there's an overcorrection, right? Where where lawmakers are restructuring agencies wholesale, trying to change direction in their missions, and doing different funny things with the budget, block granting, for example, funding with CDC and other things.
Right.
Which of course we know always results in cuts. And will a lot of these major ideas happen? Probably not. Not in at least the next 2 years. But it is very important that we respond. And I think it's for those of us who've been like you and I who've been doing this way too long, it's a shift in mindset from where we've been in a very offensive position, trying to move the ball forward, to now playing defense. And it's a different type of advocacy. It's a different type of mindset. But as we know, defense wins championships. So it's extremely critical that even something that seems obvious, like why is federal investment in public health important? Like this should be a no-brainer. But I don't think you can take that for granted. We really have to be making that case as a community all the time. And I think also recognizing if there is going to be movement in any legislation in a split Congress, there are going to have to be compromises. So while the House may be putting forward a bill that is cutting non-defense programs by 20%, they're increasing defense by 20%. And we know that's not going to be reality. And the Senate will have something that's a little more moderated, maybe smaller increases in non-defense, because they're working on margins of, having to get to 60 votes. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're going from extreme cuts to modest increases, there's going to have to be compromise to get to an end result. And that means, I think, the death by 1,000 cuts. It's cuts here, it's cuts there, it's seemingly minor tweaks. But, if you will, there will be blood. There will be blood on the floor at the end of the day, in an environment where you've got people who are really interested in shrinking the size of the government and those who are interested in trying to expand it as much as they can. And not everyone is going to win in that scenario. And it's actually why, unfortunately, I think it's likely that we actually don't see appropriations bills, and we'll see bills. I don't think they'll be enacted. I think it's very likely we have CRs for the next 2 years.
Yeah.
But again, it's why it's important, sign that letter, because this may be our last shot at major increases for these programs, at least for the foreseeable future. So it's why it's so critical in the next 3 weeks, Congress acts and enacts an omnibus legislation, because again, this might be it for the next
and it
couple.
bolsters the baseline of our agencies. And I also want to say that it's going to be really important to reinforce our champions, because Republican members of Congress, for example, some of them have been our greatest champions for the National Institutes of Health, and they are, one of them, Senator Blunt, is retiring, as I think that Emily mentioned. And then there's Senator Shelby and there's Senator Leahy. I mean, we are losing some champions. And so we need to reinforce those that are still there. Representative Cole, Senator Moran, for example, who may be the labor ranking member next year. And it just kind of depends on we know he's going to be ranking, but we don't know what the split is going to be. But we've got to get out there and reinforce and thank and make sure that we're making the case with on both sides of the aisle. And I am sure that there are questions for you, Emily. I've co-opted a bunch of your time, but let me bring Sam on to pose any questions that our audience may have. And I see one in the chat. Actually, Sam, are you available? There you are.
Hi. Yes, thank you so much, Emily. This has been a great conversation so far. And we do have a couple of questions in our chat. The first is, what are you hearing about dealing with or mitigating the various Medicare sequesters, PAYGO, physician's fee schedule, etc.?
So it's a great question. In full disclosure, not an issue that I track very closely, but I will say I think it's likely they get that done.
And this is the additional trimming of the budget that was part of the Budget Control Act. Is that right? But it extended a few years.
The sequestration cuts. So it's funny. Well, maybe funny, not funny. Congress likes to talk about cutting spending until they actually have to, and then they realize, oh, maybe this isn't a good idea. So for me, again, I'm not an expert on this and I haven't been monitoring it closely, but just knowing history and also knowing, frankly, the ringer the provider community has been through during the pandemic in the last 2 years, it's hard for me to see them letting those cuts go into effect now. If I were betting, I would put down money on them actually doing that as part of an end of year wrap up. But again, not my area of expertise or an issue I'm watching closely. This is just sort of my spidey sense, given just knowing Congress and how they like to think and act.
Great.
Definitely.
And I see Along has some great questions.
Yes. So speaking of Ed Long, in the 118th Congress, who do you see taking the lead on NIH funding with Senator Blunt's retirement?
That's a great question. I don't believe it's Mike Simpson.
On the Senate side, it's on the House side, it might be Mike Simpson. If Representative Cole doesn't get the there are a couple of people whose names have been mentioned, but we're gunning for Representative Cole.
I thought Cole was a shoo-in. I'm pretty sure he'll get the waiver. I hadn't heard he wouldn't.
Yeah, there have to be some deals cut, but we're very hopeful. But it is true that Representative Simpson may be who is also a champion for NIH. And on Senator Blunt, we think it's going to be Moran. Yeah.
I had also heard Shelley Moore Capito, which would also be great. I mean, More
Yeah,
Capital
absolutely.
led the reauthorization of PCORI. I think either choice is good. I would also just say on the issue of committees, because I think you made this point, Ellie, there is a lot of turnover, not just of members of committees, but leadership of committees and then their staff. So there's a lot of opportunity and need for education. And I would say not just appropriators, but also the authorizers. I think it's going to be really important. CMR is what we're calling her, Kathy McMorris Rogers, who's going to be chair of Energy and Commerce with Frank Pallone, now ranking member. You've got Chair Sanders on health, education, labor and pensions, HELP in the Senate, as well as Cassidy, who of course is a doc, and I think is really passionate about health policy. So right there, you've got 3 new folks on the authorizing committees. You're going to have potentially at least 2, possibly more, in leadership on the House committees for appropriations. And of course, I have to note, because this is very exciting, for the first time in history, we will have 4 women as the cardinals of the full committees for House and Senate. So that's very exciting. But one thing I'm watching too is, I think particularly in the House, it's going to be really interesting to me see who's appointed to what committees down dais. And I think that tells you a lot about how interested the Republicans will be in governing. There are people who are serious policymakers, and there are those that are not. And so seeing who's on what committees, and again, kind of going back to the post-2010 midterms and the Tea Party wave, you saw a lot of members of the Labor really all the Appropriations Committee, stacked with members of the Tea Party who don't want to fund the government. So having people who don't want to fund the government on the Appropriations Committee does not bode well for appropriations. So, I think who we see down dais early next year is going to tell us a lot about just how productive they plan to be. And again, productivity is going to be hard. I mean, that's historically true. We get general election and split Congress and small margins. Like, this is not a formula for success, but just the seriousness of the people on the committees and their interest in finding compromise and really working on policy solutions, I think is going to tell us a lot about what we can expect next year.
And Emily, on that note, Research America is going to be working with our alliance members. We know of some terrific members from both sides of the aisle that are really interested in labor-age.
Yeah,
they're interested in labor-age leadership, but they are really solid members. And again, both sides of the aisle. And we're going to be, targeting and strategic in trying to champion build, and also with freshman members. And so more on this in future meetings and correspondence with you. And again, you can always call, email me, Sam, with ideas, with questions, with thoughts on partnership to get some of this done. So I do think this cultivating champions for R&D and public health is really, really important going
absolutely.
forward.
Absolutely.
Sam, we have a question about Pasteur, I think.
Yes. Are you hearing that Pasteur might make the cut for a final package?
I know it's on the table and in the mix. I don't know. I can't predict. There are so many things on the table.
And Emily, quickly, the Pasteur Act is
around antimicrobial resistance. Yeah.
Right. It would establish a pull mechanism, a kind of a subscription model. Is that right? Of funding antibiotics once they're approved by FDA to try to pull more antibiotics and antimicrobials generally and antifungals into the R&D pipeline.
Yeah. And so I don't know. There's such a long list. Again, I think the provider cuts for me are an obvious choice to make the cut. When we get down the list to things like Pasteur, things like Prevent, I don't know. It's hard. They're just, again, and we're only talking in the health space. There's a whole other list of things across all the sectors that folks are hoping to get done. So I don't know.
And yeah, it's gotten to the point where it's not based on how important or right or good it is. It's based
Right.
on the number of, if we give this person this, do we have to do this on this side? And then do we have time?
And to your point about cultivation, who are the champions? And then where does this rank on their list of priorities for them, right? I mean, I think, if I'm ranking member Burr and I've got 8 things that I'm hoping to get done in my last year in the Senate, well, I'm not going to get all 8 things. So which is the thing? So where is it ranking for whom on their list? And, what is the interest in leadership in helping them to get that win? I mean, I think that's all of what plays into it more than the value of the policy. It's the seniority and the prioritization that ultimately in these types of scenarios wins out. And do they have to do it? I will say one of the things we're watching very closely is telehealth and the telehealth flexibilities that will expire 5 months after the end of the public health emergency. I'll use that as an example. This is one where it's bipartisan, costs a lot of money, but it's bipartisan. It's also one of those things I think you can't go backwards. You can't go back to the way things were and have telehealth less accessible. And I think there's some interest. I mean, the bill to extend for 2 years passed the House, wide bipartisan margins before the midterms. We know there's interest in the Senate. They could do a 2-year patch in theory on this end of year package, but do they have to? I mean, I think we can all acknowledge that the public health emergency will be extended again into the spring, and Congress is good at deadlines. They tend to kind of wait till last minute, but when there's an actual deadline, they will tend to try to move. And so I think the fact that there's a cushion there where there isn't a real deadline in January, which then would have actually put the real deadline to May. We're now looking at kind of an April public health emergency extension, which then puts the deadline 5 months out, which is kind of coinciding with the end of next fiscal year. Do we have to do telehealth right now? I mean, I hope they do. But, again, it's like, do they have to do it right now?
Yeah. Sam, it looks like there's a very cool question in the chat, but I don't think we're going to be able to respond to it now. It looks like what percentage of I'm guessing it's the health budget, not the R&D budget, is spent on chronic disease prevention outlook for the future. So if you want to shoot us your email address, you can shoot Sam or me your email address. We'd be glad to look into that and get an answer back to you. But Emily, unless you're even more amazing than I think, you might not have that off the top of your head.
I will need to double check, but I believe we spend roughly $4 trillion a year in health care. I believe the number is about 5% on prevention. It might be 1%. Don't quote me. It's definitely less than 10. Which again is why you hear us advocates talk about the value of prevention, and we have a sick care system. We don't have a health care system. And primordial prevention and trying to get upstream, and it is the chronic diseases that are driving our healthcare expenditures. 75% of what we spend in Medicare is on chronic disease. It's not sustainable. So you're appreciating. I don't know who asked that. I can't see their name in the chat. This is it. I mean, the challenge I'm finding is making that case. If we have time, I'll share a story. I'm not going to call them out. But I was at an event with a longtime appropriator, Republican, one I would consider a friend of public health and research. And I asked this question about the prevention conundrum. Like, how do we get members of Congress to spend more in prevention? And, don't you care about ROI? I mean, we know there's ROI, keeping people healthy, keeping them out of the healthcare system is going to save money down the road and blah, 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 blah. And, he very kind of matter-of-factly said, you're probably right, but you have to understand, I hear this all the time. If you spend money on education now, you'll save money later. If you spend on research now, you'll save money later. If you spend on public health now, you spend on roads and bridges now, you'll save money later. I can't afford to save all this money. And it was like this aha moment. And I think also as he framed it was, the savings that you see, if there are 20 years down the road. Well, I'm not going to be a member of Congress in 20 years. Like, I need to know, what impact is this having on my community right now? And I think that's frankly a real advantage medical research has. And I think Research America does an amazing job of communicating this, is like, what is this impact having in your community right now in terms of jobs, academic, medical centers, universities in many communities are the largest employers. Making that connection to job, it's about hope and cure and all the things, but it's also just at a very baseline core level, this is impacting your community right now. It is stimulating economic growth. It's creating jobs. That's what resonates for members of Congress, because they're especially in the House are thinking in 2-year cycles, and they want to be able to say, here's what I did for our community right now. It's why earmarks have value. Look what I did for our community, colleagues, right? It's very transactional and at a very micro level. They're not thinking global savings to Medicare 25 years from now. That's not.
I'll say that our friends and colleagues at United for Medical Research head to their websites for some terrific resources in terms of the return on NIH at the state and district level, the economic return, just fabulous work. I know we only have a few minutes, and I know that I've gotten some questions via email, one being pandemic preparedness. And I think the issue there, the reason we're not going to probably see that supplemental is because it is a supplemental. Although members of Congress seem to be pretty comfortable with supplemental funding for disaster relief for Ukraine, Republicans have said they want any more pandemic preparedness funding, particularly COVID funding, to be paid for. And those pay-fors are not coming forth by the end of the year. It's very, very unlikely. And so that's where that sits. The other question has to do with ARPA-H. And Emily, I don't know what you're predicting, but and it would be great to get it done, but probably the priority for Senator Blunt may be Prevent Pandemics Act. And that's an authorizing bill. That's not money. And there are differences between the House and the Senate and the administration on where ARPA-H should be housed, in not just location, but who should, what the line of
the chain of command, if you want.
Chain of command. And so my guess is it's going to be very unlikely that that is authorized. That doesn't end it'll still move forward as it is now, but it won't be authorized this year, almost certainly. Emily, is that your take?
I feel the same way, Ellie. Well, and I think some of this is nuanced. In fact, it is authorized because it has funding. So again, when you think about it in the list of like, oh my gosh, what among the 7,000 things people want to tack on to this end of year package, do we have to do this? Not really. I mean, would it be nice to do? Sure, it'd probably be good to have some authorities and clarify some roles, but is it a must do? I don't think so. So again, that's one for me that it doesn't mean it doesn't come up next year and legislation is reintroduced and maybe you see some progress there. But frankly, until there's probably a problem, like, is it something that needs to happen? As long as funding's being appropriated, I don't know that it needs to be done. So I'm kind of with you on that one. I don't think it happens this year.
And I think it's another opportunity for Research America Alliance members together to talk about is, we want to make sure that ARPA-H supplements, not supplants NIH dollars, and help make sure it does the cool things that it's, can do in this space. So I know, Brad, you have a question about supply chains and the NDAA. Now, Emily has surprised me before.
No. But NDAA is not my thing. Not my thing.
We may have to.
Ed Long might have thoughts if he's working on NDAA.
Ed, if you want to unmute and give us an answer,
get that done, I don't know the micro issues in there.
Did include, Ed is just reiterating what you said, Emily, that appropriators did appropriations dollars to keep it moving without an authorization bill. Hey, Sam, do we have other, I know we only have a few more minutes. Sam, are there other questions?
I think we've gotten through all of the chat questions from the audience. So if I may, we'll pose one more question before we finish up.
Perfect.
Which is, do you have any words of wisdom as we enter the new Congress and as we work towards the end of the year for advocates?
I love that. I do. Educate, 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 educate. When you think you've educated too much, keep educating. Keep that I think is going to be the key. It's why groups like Research America are so important. Because I think of when I think about advocacy and groups like the American Heart Association or groups like the Research America, it's really we're like the coaches, right? We're designing the plays, we're monitoring, we're watching the tape, but it's really up to the advocates as the team to do it, to execute, because it's the voices of the community that matter the most. So lawmakers, I can talk to everybody, but they're like, yeah, Emily, that's great. But when they're hearing from their constituents and they're getting a bunch of phone calls and they're getting a bunch of emails and people are meeting with them face to face, and lawmakers, it may surprise you, they don't like telling people no to their face. So it's just being as visible as you possibly can on all the things. And there's going to be a lot of silliness, and it's going to be like, what is happening? You're going to be like, what? What did they? But you have to take every threat seriously. And you have to be vigilant, and it will be tiring. It will be frustrating. I think we have to recalibrate expectations about what success looks like. But every single conversation you have, even if it doesn't feel like it in the moment, is really meaningful and very important. So
that's amazing. And
that would be my advice.
It comes back. As somebody who's been in advocacy for a lot of years, it comes back. So speak up. And
today's staffer is tomorrow's Speaker of the House. It is truly a marathon, not a sprint. And you never know, where that freshman member is going to be in 6 years or 8 years. And so every member matters, every vote matters. And you never know. You can find unlikely champions in people that if you're watching their Twitter feed or you're seeing them on the cable news and you're like, what are they talking about? But they can be a champion. So just keep an open mind, be vigilant, and just stay at it and do what Research America says, and you'll be fine.
Amen. So I think with that, we have a little bit of housekeeping in terms of very cool meetings coming up. Nothing as cool as Emily. But thank you so much, Emily. We're going to be calling you again. You know that.
I love it. I'm here for it. Anytime, anything for you, Ellie. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Good seeing you.
So for our audience members, we hope that you can join us next week on Tuesday, December 6th. We're going to be joined by Carol Lee, who is the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Women's Health Access Matters. There's a link to register in the chat now, and it promises to be a very interesting conversation. So we really hope you can join us.
Let me mention that Carol Lee is fabulous. She makes the economic case for women's health research. And her story is fascinating. So do join us. This one's going to be super cool.
Yes, absolutely. And with that, I think we'll thank you all for your attendance. And thank you again, Emily, for joining us. It was a great conversation. We really appreciate it.
And have your organization sign on to our letter.
Yes, please. Yeah. Link in the
sign
chat.
The letter. Make those calls right now. End of year. Get it done.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, guys. Thank you so much.